The old woman's hands moved through the soil with practiced certainty, her fingers finding the small potato plant by touch alone in the dim light of early morning. She had learned, in those years after the hunger, that potatoes could be coaxed from even the poorest ground if you understood their language. Her granddaughter watched from the doorway of their stone cottage, wrapped in wool against the autumn chill, and wondered what stories lived in those weathered hands that had survived when so many others had not. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The year was 1852, and across the Irish countryside, a different kind of silence had settled over the land. Not the silence of death that had marked the worst years of the famine, but something quieter still, more profound. It was the silence of a people learning to live again, to trust the earth beneath their feet, to plant seeds and dare to believe they might see harvest. The great hunger had passed, they said, though its shadow stretched long across every field and village, every family and hearth. In County Cork, where the land rolled green and gentle toward the sea, Michael Brennan stood at the edge of his small holding and counted his blessings in a way he had never done before the hunger came. 3 children living, when once he had 5. A wife whose laughter had returned, though more quietly than before. 40 acres that his family had worked for generations, though they owned not a single foot of it, paying rent to a landlord they had never seen, whose agent collected coins they could barely spare. But Michael had seed potatoes in his shed, sound ones, carefully selected and stored. He had learned to recognize the signs of blight now, that peculiar smell, the dark lesions on leaves and stems. Every farmer had become a student of disease, an expert in the subtle variations of rot. They checked their fields twice daily during the growing season, hearts tight with fear, ready to harvest early at the first sign of trouble. The potato, which had once been taken for granted, had become both blessing and curse, savior and destroyer. His eldest son, Patrick, was 14 now, tall and strong despite the hungry years. The boy had been 10 when the worst of it hit, old enough to remember everything, young enough to have his growth stunted by those seasons of want. He worked beside his father with a seriousness that sometimes broke Michael's heart, too adult, too careful, as if childhood itself had been a luxury they could no longer afford. They worked together in the quiet of dawn, turning soil that had lain fallow the previous year. The government had stopped the public works now, those make-work schemes that had employed thousands in digging roads to nowhere, breaking rocks into smaller rocks, earning pennies that could barely buy cornmeal from the relief depots. The workhouses still operated, those dreaded institutions where families were separated and labor was extracted in exchange for thin soup and crowded beds. But fewer went there now, choosing instead the dignity of hunger at home over the shame and certain death that waited behind those stone walls. Michael's sister had died in the workhouse at Skibbereen, along with her 3 youngest children. He did not speak of it, but sometimes at night, when sleep would not come, he would see her face as it had been before the hunger, round and smiling, quick with laughter. He tried not to think of how it must have looked at the end. The village of Ballycross, where they went to market and to church, had changed in ways both visible and invisible. Houses stood empty, their thatched roofs collapsed, their gardens returning to wild. Of the 80 families that had lived there in 1845, fewer than 40 remained. Some had died, buried in mass graves when there was no longer wood for coffins or strength for proper funerals. Others had left, joining the great tide of emigration that poured from Ireland's shores like blood from an open wound. Father Donald Murphy, whose hair had gone white during the famine years, said Mass in a church half empty, his voice carrying over pews where entire families once sat. He had performed last rites so many times during those years that the Latin words sometimes came to him in his sleep, and he would wake with the taste of sacred oil on his lips and tears on his cheeks. Now he preached of hope and renewal, of God's mysterious ways, but his eyes held the memories of all those he had been unable to save. The priest had fought with the landlord's agent about evictions during the worst years, pleading for mercy, for time, offering what little money the church had to keep families in their homes. Sometimes it had worked, more often it had not. He had watched as crowbar brigades came to tumble cottages, rendering them uninhabitable, leaving families with nothing but the sky for shelter. He had stood in the rain beside huddled groups of people, offering prayers and what comfort he could, knowing it was not nearly enough. Now, in these quieter years, Father Murphy walked among his remaining parishioners with a gentleness born of shared suffering. He knew every family's loss, every empty seat that represented a child taken by fever, a father dead of starvation, a mother who had simply stopped eating so her children might have one more meal. He carried these stories like stones in his pockets, heavy and sharp-edged, impossible to set down. At the village shop, which had somehow survived when so many others closed, Mary Donovan measured out tea and sugar, flour and salt with careful precision. Her prices were fair, fairer than they had been before the famine, when competition kept costs low. Now she was often the only source of supplies for miles around, and she remembered too well what it had been like to have nothing to sell, to watch people with money in their hands find empty shelves, to know that no amount of coins could conjure food from air. She had been young when the hunger came, barely married, childless still. The childlessness had seemed a tragedy then, a cross to bear. During the famine years she had come to see it differently, watching mothers go mad with grief over children they could not feed, seeing families torn apart by decisions no one should ever have to make. Her shop had become an unofficial relief center, a place where she distributed what little she had as fairly as possible, sometimes giving on credit that she knew would never be repaid, sometimes simply giving, with no expectation of return. Now, 7 years after the worst of it, people still came to her shop carrying that mix of gratitude and shame. Remembering her kindness, unable quite to meet her eyes, she never mentioned what was owed, never pressed for payment of those old debts. Some people paid when they could, a few pennies here and there, and she accepted it with a nod and a smile, updating ledgers that had become more memorial than accounting. Her husband, Thomas, worked the land they rented from Lord Ashford's estate, 30 acres that he farmed with a caution that had not existed before the blight. He grew potatoes still, because they had to, because nothing else could produce enough food from poor soil to keep a family fed. But he also planted oats and barley now, turnips and cabbage, diversifying in a way that his father and grandfather never had. The Irish had learned, in the hardest way possible, what came of depending too heavily on a single crop. Thomas had strong opinions about the landlords and the English government, opinions he shared quietly with trusted friends over pints at the village pub. The British had let them starve, he said, though there had been food enough in Ireland to feed everyone if it had not been exported to England. Ships had left Irish ports laden with grain and cattle, while people died in the ditches beside the roads those ships traveled. It was a thing that could not be forgiven, should not be forgotten. But Thomas was also practical, knew that anger alone would not feed his wife or plant his fields. He worked hard and kept his head down, paid his rent on time, and tried to build something that might last. Like everyone who had survived, he had learned that survival itself was a kind of resistance, a refusal to vanish completely from the land his people had worked for generations. The children who had lived through the famine carried their own particular marks. They were quieter than children had been before, more serious, prone to hoarding food even when there was plenty. Teachers noticed it in the hedge schools that were slowly reopening, the way students would pocket pieces of bread from their lunches, saving them against some future hunger that lived in their memories more vividly than the present moment's plenty. Bridget O'Connor, who taught 20 children in a borrowed barn, knew each of her students' stories. There was Sean, whose parents had both died in the workhouse, now living with an uncle who worked him like a grown man. There was Mered, whose smile never reached her eyes. who had watched her baby brother die of fever, while the family huddled in their cottage with no fuel for fire and no food for sustenance. There was Liam, bright and quick with numbers, who startled at loud noises and could not bear to be touched unexpectedly. Bridget taught them reading and writing, arithmetic and history, though she was careful about which history she told. She spoke of Irish kings and heroes, of saints and scholars, of a time when Ireland had been the light of Europe, preserving learning while the continent descended into darkness. She did not yet speak of the famine, though it was the defining event of all their lives. That history was too recent, too raw, still being written in the empty spaces where people used to be. The land itself bore witness to those years in ways that would last generations. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for centuries lay fallow, their owners dead or departed. Stone walls crumbled where no one remained to maintain them. Roads built during the public works schemes zigzagged across the countryside in peculiar patterns. Monuments to bureaucratic decisions made by officials who had never visited Ireland, who imagined they were teaching the lazy Irish the value of hard work, who could not conceive that people were dying not from lack of effort, but from lack of food. In the larger towns where the famine's effects had been less devastating but still profound, life was slowly returning to something that resembled normalcy. Markets operated again with actual goods for sale. Shops displayed fabrics and tools, household goods and small luxuries. The workhouses still held hundreds of inmates, families who had lost everything, who had nowhere else to go, but the numbers were declining as people found ways to rebuild their lives, or chose emigration over continued struggle. The emigration was itself a kind of catastrophe, a bleeding away of Ireland's future. Ships left weekly from Cork and Dublin, Galway and Belfast, packed with people seeking better lives in America, Canada, Australia. They traveled in steerage, crowded into holds designed for cargo, paying passage that consumed their last resources, carrying little but hope and desperation. Some of these ships earned the name coffin ships, overcrowded and unsanitary, breeding grounds for typhus and cholera. The journey itself could kill. Weeks at sea on starvation rations, disease spreading in the cramped quarters, bodies buried at sea when the journey ended before the destination was reached. Those who survived arrived in places like Boston and New York, Quebec and Toronto, often sick, always poor, facing discrimination and hardship in new forms. But the letters that came back spoke of work and wages, of land that could be owned, of meals that included meat. These letters were read aloud in kitchens and pubs, passed from hand to hand, creating dreams and desperation in equal measure. Young people especially felt the pull of elsewhere, the sense that Ireland held no future for them, that the only way forward was away. In Ballycross, the Brennan family received such a letter from Michael's younger brother, who had left for Boston in 1850. He wrote of hard work on the docks, of a room he shared with 5 other men, of wages that seemed princely by Irish standards. He urged Michael to come, said he could find him work, promised that the children would have opportunities impossible in Ireland. Michael read the letter by candlelight while his wife, Catherine, mended clothes and listened. They did not speak of it immediately, but both felt the weight of the decision pressing on them. To stay meant poverty, meant working land they would never own, meant watching their children grow up with limited prospects. To go meant leaving everything they knew, risking the dangerous voyage, starting over in a place where they knew only one person and spoke the language imperfectly. Catherine's parents were buried in the Ballycross churchyard, along with the 2 children she had lost to fever during the hungry years. The thought of leaving them felt like abandonment, like a final severing of ties that held her to the only life she had known. But she also knew what it meant to bury children, and if America offered her surviving 3 a better chance, could she refuse it out of attachment to the dead? These conversations happened in kitchens and cottages across Ireland in those years after the famine. Families weighing impossible choices, trying to balance love of home against love of children, the pull of ancestors against the promise of future. Some decided to go, some to stay, and both carried guilt for the choice they made. For those who remained, the work of rebuilding took many forms. Fields had to be restored, cottages repaired, systems of agriculture reinvented. The old ways of dividing land among all sons had contributed to the crisis, creating holdings too small to support families even in good years. Now people began to think differently about inheritance, about keeping land together, about sending younger sons to trades or to the church or to America rather than subdividing plots into uselessness. The landlords, whose own fortunes had often suffered during the famine, were in some cases more willing to make improvements, to invest in drainage and buildings, to offer longer leases that encouraged tenants to improve the land. But this was far from universal, and many estates remained in the hands of absentee landlords who cared only for the rent rolls, who saw Ireland as an inconvenient source of income rather than a place where people actually lived. Lord Ashford, whose estate encompassed much of the land around Ballycross, was one of the absentee landlords, an Englishman who visited Ireland once in his life and found it depressing. His agent, James Carson, was a local man caught between his own people and his employer's interests. During the famine, Carson had tried to moderate the worst of the evictions, to grant extensions on rent, to argue for relief measures. He had been partially successful, which meant he had failed more often than he had succeeded. Now Carson walked the estate with mixed feelings, seeing the abandoned cottages, the fields returning to rough pasture, the reduced population. From a purely economic standpoint, the famine had solved certain problems. There were fewer tenants to manage, less subdivision of land, higher yields from the fields that remained in cultivation. But the human cost haunted him, and he knew that his neighbors saw him as complicit in their suffering, even as he had tried to help. He had a ledger in his office that listed all the families who had lived on Lord Ashford's land in 1845. More than half the names now had notes beside them: deceased, emigrated, evicted, whereabouts unknown. Each notation represented stories Carson tried not to think about, decisions he had been forced to make, consequences he would carry for the rest of his life. In the evenings, Carson would sometimes ride to the edges of the estate and look out over the land as the sun set, painting everything gold and soft. Ireland was beautiful in a way that broke the heart, green and ancient, marked by human habitation going back thousands of years. The stone walls and hedgerows, the ruined abbeys and holy wells, the layers of history visible in every landscape spoke of continuity, of people persisting despite everything. But now there were new ruins, recent ones, cottages tumbled during evictions, or simply abandoned when their occupants died or fled. These would eventually be absorbed into the landscape, become picturesque themselves, lose the sharp sting of their origins. Carson wondered if future generations would know what had happened here, if they would understand that the emptiness was not natural, but created, that the silence was the silence of ghosts. The parish priest, Father Murphy, had his own ledger, a record of deaths and baptisms, marriages and burials. The death entries for 1847 and 1848 ran for pages, sometimes multiple names per day, whole families gone in a week. The baptisms had slowed to a trickle during those years, as women stopped conceiving or lost pregnancies to malnutrition, as infants died before they could be brought to the font. Now the baptisms were increasing again, slowly. Life was reasserting itself, people daring to hope that children born now might survive, might have futures. But the marriage records remained sparse. So many young people had emigrated, leaving an imbalance of ages and genders. The young men especially had left seeking work, planning to send money home or to bring families over later. The young women who remained often had limited prospects, and many eventually emigrated themselves, going to American cities to work as domestic servants, sending wages back to support parents and siblings. Father Murphy performed these emigration blessings in his church, giving young people medals of St. Christopher and Mary, praying for their safe passage, knowing he would likely never see them again. He kept a map in his study with pins marking where his former parishioners had gone, and the map was more dense with pins than the parish itself. A diaspora spreading across the globe, carrying Ireland with them in memory and song and accent and custom, in stories told to children born in foreign lands. The older people, those who had survived the famine and chosen to remain, carried their experiences in their bodies and their behaviors. They wasted nothing, saved everything, planned obsessively for future disasters. Women who had once been particular about their homes, keeping everything just so, now hoarded food in ways that disturbed their children. Men who had once been generous and easygoing became miserly, unable to let go of even a penny without anxiety. This transmission of trauma, this passing of fear and caution to the next generation, would mark Irish character for decades to come. Children who had never experienced famine grew up in households shaped by it, learning habits of scarcity, developing anxieties about security, absorbing stories of suffering that became part of their identity, whether they had lived through it or not. In Ballycross, old Seamus McCarthy sat outside the pub most afternoons, when weather permitted, smoking his pipe and watching the road. He was 73 years old, had lived through the famine, and seen things he would not speak of, though sometimes when drunk he would begin a story and then stop mid-sentence, staring into space, unable or unwilling to continue. The younger men treated him with respect, buying him pints, listening when he spoke of earlier times before the hunger. He told stories of festivals and patterns, weddings that lasted 3 days, harvests celebrated with music and dancing. He spoke of a village full of life and laughter, of traditions and customs that had been maintained for generations, of a way of life that had seemed eternal and was now gone. Seamus had lost his wife and 4 of his 5 children to famine fever. His surviving daughter had emigrated to New York and wrote occasionally letters full of details about her work as a seamstress, about the tenement where she lived, about her hopes to marry an Irish policeman she had met at church. She sent money when she could, and Seamus saved it carefully, though he had no particular plans for it, no goals beyond survival. He was a living bridge to the past, one of the last who could remember Ireland as it had been before the Great Hunger, who had personal memories of the old ways. The young people sometimes asked him questions, wanting to know about the Ireland their grandparents had known, and he answered as best he could, though he knew his words could not truly convey what had been lost. At night, the village of Ballycross grew quiet early. People exhausted from physical labor, reluctant to burn candles or lamp oil unnecessarily. In the darkness, families gathered around their fires, talking in low voices, telling stories, maintaining oral traditions that had survived invasion and plague, colonization and famine. The Irish gift for language, for storytelling, for maintaining culture through words had proven more durable than stone walls or legal systems. These evening gatherings were where children learned who they were, where they came from, what it meant to be Irish. They heard about Brian Boru and the Vikings, about St. Patrick and the Druids, about the flight of the Earls and the penal laws, about the United Irishmen and the Rising of '98. And increasingly now, they heard about the famine, though parents struggled with how to tell these stories, what details to include, how to convey the truth without traumatizing children who had been too young to remember. Catherine Brennan told her youngest daughter, 5-year-old Nora, about her 2 older sisters who had died, describing them not in death but in life, their personalities and quirks, the games they played, the songs they sang. She wanted Nora to know that she had sisters, that the family had once been larger, that there were people who should have been there but were not. Michael listened to these tellings from his chair by the fire, whittling small wooden figures for Nora's amusement, and he wondered what memories his children would carry, what stories they would tell their own children someday. Would they remember Ireland as a place of suffering, or would they remember the recovery, the slow return to something like normalcy? Would they stay and help build a new Ireland, or would they join the exodus, seeking elsewhere what they could not find at home? These questions had no answers yet, existed in a future that remained unwritten. What Michael knew was the present moment, the feel of wood under his knife, the warmth of the fire, his wife's voice soft in the lamplight, his daughter's breathing as she fell asleep in her mother's arms. These small domestic moments, taken for granted before the famine, now seemed precious, worth noticing, worth remembering. The seasons turned as they always had, indifferent to human suffering or recovery. Spring came with its promise of growth, and farmers planted their crops with prayers and anxiety, checking the skies, watching for signs of blight, hoping for sun and rain in proper measure. Summer brought work from dawn to dusk, haymaking and turf cutting, tending animals and gardens, trying to produce enough to survive the coming winter. Autumn was harvest time, and the successful gathering of crops brought relief so profound it was almost painful. Each year that passed without catastrophe, without blight, without famine, was a small miracle, though people were superstitious about saying so, seemed afraid that speaking success might jinx it, might bring back the dark times they were trying so hard to leave behind. Winter remained the dangerous season, the time when stores had to stretch, when illness spread most readily, when the cold and damp of Irish cottages made life miserable for those without sufficient fuel or food. But winters in the 1850s were different from the winters of the famine years. People had food, however monotonous. They had fuel, however scarce. They had clothing, however patched and mended. They were not warm or comfortable, but they were not dying, and that distinction made all the difference. The village of Ballycross held its first Sailey in November of 1852, a gathering for music and dancing that had not happened in 7 years. Father Murphy organized it in the church hall, though some of the older women thought it improper too soon, disrespectful to the dead. But the priest argued that life must continue, that joy was not a betrayal of those who had suffered, that the dead would want the living to live. People came tentatively at first, unsure how to behave, how to reclaim traditions that had been set aside during the crisis years. The musicians tuned their fiddles and flutes, played a few notes, stopped, started again. The dancers stood around the edges of the room, watching, waiting for someone to be first. It was old Seamus McCarthy who finally broke the paralysis, standing with difficulty, offering his hand to Mary Donovan, leading her to the center of the floor. The musicians struck up a reel, something old and familiar, and Seamus and Mary began to dance, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, their feet remembering patterns their minds had half forgotten. Others joined them, couples and groups, children running between the adults, laughter rising tentatively and then more freely. It was not the same as before the famine. Everyone could feel that. The crowd was smaller, the laughter more fragile, the joy tinged with sorrow. But it was something, a beginning, a small reclamation of what had been lost. Catherine Brennan danced with her husband, feeling his arms around her, seeing his smile, rare and precious. Their children watched from the side of the room, Nora clapping along with the music, the older ones more reserved, uncertain how to join in. This too would have to be relearned, the customs and courtesies of social gathering, the ease of community celebration. Father Murphy watched from the doorway, seeing the gaps where people should have been remembering Sailey, when the hall had been packed to bursting, when you could barely move for the press of bodies, when the music had lasted until dawn. But he also saw the beginning of healing, the small brave act of choosing joy despite everything. And he offered a silent prayer of gratitude for these survivors, these stubborn people who refused to be entirely broken. As winter deepened and the year moved toward its end, the people of Ballycross and countless villages like it across Ireland settled into the rhythm of survival that was slowly becoming something more. They were not thriving yet, not prosperous, not secure in the way they had once taken for granted, but they were alive, and they were beginning to believe in future again, beginning to plant not just literal seeds, but metaphorical ones, dreams and plans that extended beyond the next meal, the next season. Michael Brennan stood in his field one December morning, frost crunching under his boots, his breath visible in the cold air. The land stretched before him, scarred and recovering, marked by the recent past but not defined by it. He thought about his brother in Boston, about the letter that remained unanswered, about the decision he and Catherine would have to make. Part of him wanted to stay, to hold on to this place that held his history, his identity, everything he knew. Another part recognized that staying might be selfishness, that his children's best chances might lie elsewhere, that love sometimes meant letting go. He did not know yet what he would decide, what they would decide together, but he knew that whatever choice they made would be informed by the famine years, shaped by what they had survived, determined by their refusal to watch their children suffer as they had suffered. In towns and cities across Ireland, similar decisions were being made in households both wealthy and poor. The famine had not been a great equalizer. The poor had suffered far more than the rich, but it had touched everyone, changed everyone, left no one entirely untouched. Even the landlords and merchants who had profited from the crisis carried their own complications, their own guilt and justifications, their own attempts to make sense of what had happened. The English government had moved on, declared the crisis over, turned its attention to other matters in other parts of the empire. But in Ireland the crisis was not over, would never be entirely over. The physical hunger might have ended, but the hunger for justice, for recognition, for acknowledgement of what had been allowed to happen, that hunger remained. Political movements were stirring. Tenant rights organizations, independence movements, groups advocating for land reform and home rule. The famine had radicalized many, had shown them the consequences of Ireland's subordinate position within the United Kingdom, had demonstrated that English politicians and landlords could not be trusted with Irish lives. These political stirrings would eventually coalesce into movements that would reshape Ireland's future, though that was still years away, still germinating in the anger and grief of the survivors. For now, in the winter of 1852, the work was simpler and more immediate. Survive, recover, remember, begin to build something that might last, might offer the next generation better than what this one had received. Plant seeds, literal and metaphorical, and hope they would take root, hope they would grow, hope that this time, this season, this year, the harvest would come. In the Brennan cottage, Catherine lit a candle as darkness fell early on the short winter day. Her children gathered around the table for their evening meal, humble but sufficient. Potatoes and cabbage, bread and butter, milk for the little ones. They said grace, and the old words took on new meaning. Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts which we are about to receive from thy bounty. A gratitude that was real and deep, earned through the experience of going without. Michael watched his family in the candlelight, seeing them as if from a distance, as if he were already in Boston looking back, or as if he were an old man remembering this moment from some unimaginable future. He saw Catherine's face, marked by hardship, but still beautiful to him, still the girl he had married with such hopes and dreams. He saw his children, alive and growing, their whole lives before them, full of possibilities he could barely imagine. And he saw the empty places at the table, the two daughters who should have been there, who lived now only in memory and in the stories they told to keep them alive. The famine had taught him that nothing could be taken for granted, that everything could be lost, that the world was far more precarious than he had ever imagined as a young man. But it had also taught him about resilience, about the human capacity to endure and continue, about the power of small moments of grace in the midst of suffering. Across Ireland that winter, in thousands of cottages and houses, similar scenes were playing out. Families gathering, meals being shared, stories being told, memories being preserved. The famine had tried to break them, had broken many, but had not broken all. Those who remained were changed, scarred, marked by what they had survived. But they remained, and in that remaining, in that stubborn refusal to disappear completely, there was a kind of victory. The land itself was patient, indifferent to human timescales, working on its own ancient rhythms. It had seen peoples come and go, civilizations rise and fall, had absorbed blood and tears and been renewed by them. The stones in the walls had stood for hundreds of years and would stand for hundreds more. The trees that had survived the famine, not cut for coffins or firewood, continued to grow, adding rings that would someday record these years, though they would not record the stories, the suffering, the small brave acts of continuing. In the village of Ballycross, lights appeared one by one in cottage windows as evening deepened, small beacons against the dark. From a distance, if you did not know the history, the village might have looked peaceful, timeless, unchanging. You would not have seen the absence, the missing houses, the population reduced to half what it had been. You would not have known the cost of survival, the price paid in lives and dreams and futures that would never be. But those who lived there knew. They carried the knowledge in their bodies, in their memories, in the way they moved through the world, now with a caution that had not existed before. They were the survivors, the ones who would tell the story, the ones whose children would pass it on, creating a historical memory that would shape Irish identity for generations to come. Father Murphy made his evening rounds, visiting the sick and elderly, bringing communion to those too frail to attend Mass, offering his presence and his prayers to those who needed comfort. He had aged visibly during the famine years, his hair gone white, his face deeply lined, but his faith, tested severely, had somehow survived. He could not explain the suffering, could not reconcile a loving God with what he had witnessed, but he continued to serve, to offer what comfort he could, to be present with his people in their pain and their recovery. At the home of Widow Sullivan, who was dying slowly of a wasting sickness, he sat beside her bed and held her hand, listening as she spoke of her life, her regrets, her fears about dying. She had lost her husband and 3 children to the famine, and her fear now was not of death itself, but of being forgotten, of leaving no mark, of having suffered for nothing. Father Murphy assured her that she would be remembered, that her life had meaning, that her suffering had not been in vain. He was not sure he believed his own words, but he spoke them anyway, because what else could he offer? What else could any of them offer each other but the small comfort of presence, of bearing witness, of refusing to let each other disappear into the silence? As he walked home through the cold night, stars visible in the clear sky, Father Murphy thought about memory and forgetting, about how histories are written and who gets to write them. He knew that the official accounts of the famine, when they were written, would likely blame the Irish. Themselves would speak of overpopulation, and dependency would minimize the role of government policy, and landlord greed would make it seem like a natural disaster rather than a preventable catastrophe. But he also knew that the Irish would tell their own story, would pass it down through generations, would make sure the truth survived even if it was not acknowledged in official histories. The songs and stories, the poems and keening, the personal testimonies and family histories, these would preserve what had happened in a way that government records never could. The young women who came of age in the 1850s faced a marriage market severely distorted by emigration and population loss. There were fewer men, and those who remained were often cautious about marriage, reluctant to take on the responsibility of a family when they barely had enough for themselves. The age of marriage rose, and many women remained single, living with their families, working the land alongside their brothers and fathers, occupying a liminal space in a society that had little room for unmarried adult women. Catherine Brennan, Michael's wife, watched her daughters grow and worried about their futures in ways she had not worried about her sons. Nora, the youngest, who had no memory of the famine, seemed somehow lighter than her older sister, less burdened by history. But even Nora would grow up in a world shaped by the famine, would absorb its lessons and limitations, would make choices constrained by what had happened before she was born. The education system was slowly expanding in Ireland. Schools opening that had been closed during the famine, teachers training, curriculum developing. The Irish language, which had been in decline even before the famine, suffered another major blow during those years, as many Irish speakers died or emigrated, and as English became increasingly seen as necessary for economic survival. The hedge schools, where Irish had often been the language of instruction, were giving way to national schools where English was enforced. This linguistic shift was another form of loss, another way the famine had changed Ireland. The language that had been spoken for thousands of years, that carried Irish culture and ways of thinking, was being displaced, relegated to the poorest regions, becoming a marker of backwardness rather than a source of pride. Later generations would mourn this loss and try to revive the language, but the damage done in the famine years and immediately after would prove nearly impossible to reverse. In literature and art, the famine was beginning to be represented, though tentatively and incompletely. Poets wrote of hunger and death, of departure and loss. Artists painted scenes of eviction and emigration, trying to capture what had happened, to create a visual record. But much of this work was still to come, created by those who had lived through the famine as children and needed distance before they could approach it artistically. The ballads and songs that emerged in the years after the famine told stories of suffering and injustice, of landlords and agents, of eviction and emigration. These songs were performed at gatherings and seilis, passed from person to person, carried by emigrants to their new homes, becoming part of the Irish cultural heritage. Some were angry, some were sad, some were defiant, but all bore witness to what had happened, refused to let it be forgotten or minimized. In the larger context of world history, the Irish famine was one disaster among many, one tragedy in a century that would see massive changes and upheavals. But for the Irish, it was the defining event, the rupture that divided history into before and after, the catastrophe that changed everything. And unlike many historical events that fade with time, the famine remained vivid in Irish memory, passed down through generations, shaping Irish identity and Irish politics in ways that would last well into the 20th century. The emigrants who left Ireland carried the famine with them, told their stories in their new homes, created Irish communities abroad that maintained their connection to Ireland while building new lives. The Irish in America, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere became powerful political forces, sending money back to Ireland, supporting independence movements, maintaining cultural traditions, creating a global Irish diaspora that would eventually number far more than the population of Ireland itself. Back in Ballycross, as the 1850s gave way to the 1860s, the immediate crisis of the famine receded further into memory. New crises arose. New challenges had to be met. New generations came of age with their own concerns and priorities. But the famine remained, a presence in every family history, a reference point for every difficulty, a measure of suffering that nothing else quite matched. Michael Brennan grew old on the land he had worked all his life, watching his children and eventually his grandchildren grow up. He never stopped checking the potato plants for signs of blight, never stopped feeling anxiety when harvest approached, never quite believed in abundance even when it appeared. Catherine aged beside him, her hair going white, her body bent from years of physical labor, but her spirit somehow unbroken, still capable of laughter, still finding joy in small things. They were survivors, and they knew it, wore it as a kind of identity. They had lived through something terrible and had come out the other side, and that experience had marked them in ways both visible and invisible. They were more cautious than they had been before, less trusting, more aware of how quickly things could fall apart. But they were also more grateful, more appreciative of what they had, more conscious of each day as a gift rather than a right. As evening came to Ballycross on some ordinary day in the late 1850s, the Brennan family gathered as they always did, around their fire, sharing their meal, telling their stories. The cottage was small and crowded, drafty and damp, but it was theirs in a way that mattered. Home in the deepest sense, the place that held their history and their hopes. Outside, the Irish countryside stretched green and peaceful in the fading light, beautiful and treacherous, beloved and dangerous. The land that had nourished and failed them, that had been both mother and destroyer, continued its ancient cycles, indifferent to human drama, working on scales that made individual lives seem brief and insignificant. But inside the cottage, lit by candle and firelight, the individual lives did not seem insignificant at all. They seemed precious and profound, each person a universe of experience and memory, each story worth telling, each survival worth celebrating. And so they talked and laughed, planned and remembered, lived their lives day by day, year by year, maintaining their humanity in the face of everything that had tried to destroy it. The quiet seasons after the famine were not dramatic or heroic in obvious ways. There were no great battles or grand gestures, no moments of triumph that could be easily commemorated. Instead, there was persistence, endurance, the steady accumulation of days and seasons, the slow rebuilding of what had been lost. It was unglamorous and exhausting, often dispiriting, sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also in its own way remarkable that a people could suffer so much and yet continue, could lose so much and yet hold on to their identity, their culture, their sense of who they were. This was a kind of victory, however costly. The Irish had been tested in the most fundamental way possible, and while many had died, many had left. Many had been broken enough, had survived to ensure that Ireland itself survived diminished but not destroyed, wounded but not dead. And so the story continued, as stories do, flowing from one generation to the next, changing in the telling, but maintaining its essential truth. The children who heard about the famine from their parents and grandparents would tell it to their children, and those children to theirs, creating a chain of memory that would stretch forward through time, ensuring that what had happened would not be forgotten, that the dead would be remembered, that the suffering would mean something beyond itself. In the end, this was perhaps all that could be asked, that the story be told, that the truth be preserved, that future generations know what had happened and why, and that from this knowledge they might build something better, might create a world where such suffering was not possible, where people were valued more than profits, where human life mattered more than economic systems or political ideologies. It was a modest hope, perhaps an impossible one, but it was the hope that kept the survivors going, that made the daily struggle worthwhile, that transformed mere survival into something more meaningful. And so they continued, day after day, year after year, through the quiet seasons after the famine, rebuilding their lives and their world, carrying their dead with them, honoring their memory by refusing to give up, by insisting on continuing, by choosing life over despair. The old woman finished her work in the garden, straightened with effort, looked at her granddaughter in the doorway and smiled. The sun was rising, painting everything golden, and the day stretched ahead with its endless tasks and small satisfactions. There was work to be done, always work to be done. But there was also this moment, this connection across generations, this passing of knowledge and memory from old to young. And in that passing, in that simple act of survival and continuity, the famine was both remembered and transcended, honored and moved beyond. The story of those quiet seasons, of the years after the famine when Ireland slowly healed and rebuilt, may not be as dramatic as the story of the famine itself. But it is no less important, no less worthy of remembering, because it is the story of how people continue after catastrophe, how communities rebuild after disaster, how life goes on even in the face of overwhelming loss. It is a story of resilience and resistance, of memory and hope, of the human capacity to endure the unendurable, and to find meaning even in suffering. And it is a story that continues still, carried forward by all those who remember, who tell, who refuse to let the past be forgotten or its lessons be lost.